Hello, 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 and welcome back to DLA Alternative. It's your boy Brandon, and I hope everyone is doing phenomenal as always. And thank you as always to everyone who keeps subscribing, liking, and following this journey with us. We are on the road to 2K, people, so keep helping us get there. And yes, as you can tell, I am already in the Halloween mood. I got a bunch of shit up all in my fucking house. But more importantly, yes, as you could tell by the thumbnail and title, we are going to get into a very interesting topic, and this is going to be called The Curious Case of Mr. Clarke Theory. So, what does this mean? Okay, I have been analyzing this man so damn thoroughly, you have no idea, and I have analyzed every single scene, everything that's going on around him, okay, how I normally do. But what I have been looking for, okay, in this theory is more than just his lessons that he's teaching us, okay, that I've always been curious about those, and I'm sure a lot of you have. But what I have been looking for, okay, is a pattern, okay? A pattern to something that will point out why and what to look for involving his lessons. So, as I have analyzed this, I have come across something that has been very interesting to me and made me very, very curious. But what I am talking about is the fact that there is a difference between when Mr. Clarke is teaching a lesson, okay, he teaches us every lesson he actually tells us, okay, that's confusing. But there is a difference between when he chooses to teach it, okay, and when he's being asked to teach it, all right? And that's the key, that's what I have realized there is a pattern, okay? So if we think about this, all right, that might sound confusing to you, but if you think in season 1, every lesson Mr. Clarke teaches us, okay, is asked, all right, except that very first lesson, very, very quickly. But basically, the first time we ever see him, okay, is when the boys walk up to him after class and they say, "Did it come?" And he kind of makes a joke, and he's like, don't mean to be the bearer of bad news, all right? And then he goes, "It came." And what Mr. Clarke is talking about, we all know, people, is his Heathkit Ham Shack radio, okay? So that's the biggest thing, the very first thing we kind of get a little idea that's important to this show. But as the boys are looking, okay, they kind of start putting their own information out there. That's where this gets interesting, where he's not really teaching us a lesson. He's kind of suggesting something. And what Mr. Clarke does is he suggests that we should think bigger, okay? So as I took that lesson, all right, I started thinking more deeply about this. And as we know throughout this season 1, okay, we know we get the famous scene with the flea and the acrobat explanation about the many worlds of interpretation, and the fact that the upside down is basically the exact echo and mirrored version of our dimension. But what Mr. Clarke explains is that there's an infinite amount of variations of our timeline, all within our timeline, and from that point to the upside down point, okay? So he leaves that out. They don't really talk about that too much. And the main reason being is because they start getting on the D&D references, and they start getting into the Veil of Shadows and how that compares to the upside down and all that shit. But what's interesting about Mr. Clarke is we see him in a lot of different scenarios and situations, all right? Specifically, he meets Eleven, okay? And that's a very interesting situation to this show. Basically, within that, okay, he's not really being asked anything. He kind of just gives some answers. He gives them the keys to later go find their own answers. So that's very symbolic in that scenario. But more specific, okay, Mr. Clarke is also asked by this Connie lady when she goes to his house. She's the one who tries and gets answers from him, okay? So he's being asked in this scenario. But what's interesting about this, okay, is that in season 1, when he is not asked to do something, okay, let's say he volunteers to do something, is involving Will's search party. So I thought about this, is that's kind of the only time within season 1 where we don't see him asked to do this, okay, he does this out of his own respect. If we don't look at Mr. Clarke like, oh, he's suspicious, like some people out there believe, all right, but just that he's a good person, and this is a time that he volunteered to help. This is where it gets very interesting and where we should get very curious about this and what he's curious about, because what he does is the first time this happens is he tries to introduce himself to Hopper, and as we know, people, he introduces himself to Hopper, which leads to a conversation about Hopper's daughter, and that's kind of the first time we ever really hear a lot of information about Sarah Hopper, okay? So what I want you to keep in mind is a lot of people talk about this, talk about the scenario, and what he ends up being curious about, Mr. Clarke specifically, all right, is the fact that Hopper ends up lying to him. And more specifically about the fact that his daughter lives in the city with his mom, and not that his daughter is dead. And some random lady ends up telling him this. And that's what Mr. Clarke is curious about. So in this show, that has been a thing with a lot of Stranger Things fans that so many people are so curious about. So if you think about Mr. Clarke a little deeper about what he's actually curious about, what he wants to teach or what he wants to learn, that, my friends, is something that led me onto a motherfucking pattern. And let me tell you, it led me into a weird thing involving Will and how he connects to shit. But real quickly, the second time we see him volunteer, okay, in season 1 is the second time we see him at the search party. And this is the one that gets very interesting and that we should be curious about. Basically, we're seeing a conversation between Hopper and the other cops, and then all of a sudden they hear whistles blowing, and it's Mr. Clarke blowing his whistle because he found a clue, okay? So if we're curious about this, this is what we should be interested in, involving clues in the show, in my opinion. Basically, we should be looking for signs of 11, okay, and pieces of 11, just like this is a piece of her hospital gown. Also involving how things connect from Hawkins' lab into the forest or into actual Hawkins through tunnels or pipes. And yes, that might sound very confusing, but if you think about this as very symbolic, this is how some of these things play out, all right? Specifically that this is also involving trying to figure out answers involving Will Byers' disappearance, okay? That's the symbolism here. And what we see in the show is we get kind of signs of that as this show progresses, all right? Specifically say tunnels is the next season, a big thing involving season 2. And that connection, all right, that tunnel connection involving Mr. Clarke right here is where things get very, very interesting, okay? And you might not ever even realize that, but in season 2 is when things get different with Mr. Clarke. Basically, people, in season 2 is when Mr. Clarke actually teaches us stuff, okay? Where he's not being asked, where we actually get Mr. Clarke lessons. And what do I mean by that? I mean by his own accord, like his own lessons, whether this is school curriculum whatsoever or not, except the lessons that he's teaching us are so specific. And so specific to what's going on with Will Byers necessarily. And that's why people get so confused and so suspicious sometimes of Mr. Clarke, in my opinion. But what you got to keep in mind about Mr. Clarke is that one of the last times we see him, all right, is very interesting, is that we see him involved with Connie and that he's kind of giving them answers about who is involved with the radio and the AV club. More specifically being the boys, as we know. But that's the thing, is the very last time we see Mr. Clarke is when he gives us answers about the sensory deprivation tank. Basically what we end up knowing in the show as the Nina Project, and something that is involved with everything that involved with 11 creating this gate. So, as we know, this is a very, very specific type of thing, and this is very interesting to Mr. Clarke. But what Season 2 does is Season 2 changes up completely. Because, as we know in the show, the lessons Mr. Clarke starts teaching us is specifically about the brain, which is the very first lesson he teaches us. And then all of a sudden, what's interesting is Mr. Clarke is the one that introduces us to Max. Basically, when Max first comes into class, all right, after we know of the name Mad Max, all right, she comes into class and Mr. Clarke stops her and basically tries to make her look like a celebrity. He pretty much tries to make her look like a star, okay, to the story, that she's very important, all right? And that's what we should be curious about. And as we know, as this show has progressed, we know that Max in Season 5 is going to be a very, very significant part to this story, obviously. So, if we connect Max, all right, Max has a direct connection to her brother Billy, which has a significant role to Season 3 and what's going on and what connects to. And then in Season 2, which is the season we're currently in, and I mean currently in this theory, alright, so don't get confused, but what I mean by that is that in this season of Season 2, alright, the main focus is Will. So, as I'm thinking about this, I'm trying to find a connection involving all of this, involving something that can connect what Mr. Clarke has taught us in this show, people. And that's the thing, is I would have never, ever in my mind thought I would have found something that would have connected these dots the same way. And that's the thing, people, is if you don't overlook everything that Mr. Clarke says, which at the very beginning of this theory, which it took me a little bit to try and catch on to this, but there is a very, very overlooked lesson that Mr. Clarke teaches us, and it's the very first words that ever come out of his mouth. So you might be very confused, people, okay? Because in season 3, as we know, the Mr. Clarke's lessons, he kind of becomes out of this story, which I hate, and I hope he comes back for season 5. But in season 3, okay, the story becomes about Billy, but also the other story of this, about how all of this Russian involvement is involved with this show and what they're doing during this season. But what you got to keep in mind is that we only get a little bit of Mr. Clarke because this is summertime, and that's when Joyce goes there and she talks about the magnets and the electromagnetic fields and how there could be a transformer that's lowering and messing and making it unstable. But it made me think that if that's all we get of Mr. Clarke, and if he never comes back, how could there be a connection to everything that he said, that a deeper connection and something that could be a clue, because he's the one who finds this first clue. And what I mean by that is this first clue involving 11 and connecting Hawkins' lab and connecting Hopper investigating this deeper, and what kind of leads this investigation into experimenting with everything. But as I went back, okay, I refreshed my memory, I refreshed on my notes, all right, and what I did is I started looking more deeply about the very first thing that Mr. Clarke ever tells us. And oddly, the very first thing he tells us is to remember something, okay? So what Mr. Clarke ends up telling the class, all right, the very first time before the boys walk up and say, oh, did it come? Did it come? Basically, Mr. Clarke is talking to the class as the bell rings and everyone's leaving and overlooking and ignoring this man, okay? And basically he says to remember to finish chapter 12 and answer 12.3 on the difference between experiment and other forms of science investigations. And then he continues, and what he says is the test will be on chapters 10 through 12, and it will be multiple choice with an essay section. And then, as we know, that's when the boys walk up and they interrupt and they just ignore everything that just was said, just like the rest of the class, and they go, oh, did it come? And they're talking about the radio. So I started thinking more deeply about that, because if we think about this, people, okay, the first thing he says is to remember this, okay? And as we know in this show, people, these episodes aren't called episodes, all right? These episodes are called chapters in this show. So it started making me think about this line specifically about a lesson we could be learning. So what I did is I took those words and I incorporated the episodes or the chapters into what he says. So basically what he tells us here now changes. What Mr. Clarke would be telling us is to remember to finish chapter 12, which would be Will the Wise, okay? And then how he says to answer 12.3. So I thought about this a little deeply, and I thought about how it says 12.3, or how 12 points to 3. So I thought how every season starts at chapter 1, okay? And basically how I'm getting chapter 12 at Will the Wise is I'm just continuing that as if these chapters would have continued as one whole story. However, as we know, they don't. They always start at chapter 1 and go upwards, all right? So it's very interesting that. I've always thought that that was a little odd why they do that. But this made me start thinking that if we just incorporate, say, chapter 8 in all of season 2 as one episode, that's just chapter 8, all right? And then when we get to season 3, okay, that first episode would be our chapter 9, and we continue how we kind of did with the season 2, getting to Will the Wise. Basically, the episode would be number 12, all right? And point 3, or pointing to season 3, would be the sauna test. So, as I started thinking about that and the terminology with all of that, no doubt in my mind, I started thinking that there could be a connection here because what he's talking about is about a test. So I continued and I'm like, okay, if what he's talking about with this connection, all right, and what to look for, how to get answers to everything involving season 1, 2, and 3, basically he says that the test is on chapters 10 through 12. Okay, so if we take that from, say, seasons 2 and 3, we now get kind of an idea of where to look for answers based off what first Mr. Clarke ever said. So, in a part 2 of this, we are going to go deep into each of those chapters. And those chapters would be chapter 10, okay, would be Trick or Treat Freak of season 2. Chapter 11 would be the Pollywog, okay, which is a very interesting episode that has a lot of multiple choices that we could choose from involving investigation. But then our chapter 12, okay, obviously would be Will the Wise. But if we continue that scenario, and how I said we just take season 2 and make that all of chapter 8 and just continue the numbers. Basically, our chapter 10, pointing to season 3, okay, would be the Mall Rats, and then chapter 11, all right, would be the case of the missing lifeguard, and then chapter 12 would be the sauna test, like I said. But like I said, in part 2 of this, what we're going to do is analyze all of those chapters in a specific way that I already kind of had prepared. But what I want to do with the rest of this one, and to close this one off, and just show that there is deeper connections to what Mr. Clarke says, connecting to other things in the show. And as we know, his lessons have deep connections to what is kind of going on in this show. But this show has its own rules, all right? And no doubt in my mind, those are just basis for us to try and understand. But what we need to do is use the entire show and everything we know and connect everything on trying to figure out how to get these answers. So what we're going to do to close this off is we're going to take the first part of what he says here. Is he says, remember to finish chapter 12, all right, which would be Will the Wise and also the sauna test. So now, if we try and compare both of those episodes, all right, it gets very, very interesting because no doubt in my mind, after I watch both of those back to back, just those 2 episodes in order, there are direct motherfucking links straight to both of those episodes with direct connections to everything that's going on. And more specifically, not just with what Will is connecting with, okay, people, but what he specifically is connecting to within that. And yes, that might sound very confusing, okay? But the point is I believe that from analyzing all of this and analyzing the connections of this, is that Will is connecting directly to fear. More specifically, that when we see this trigger, okay, that Will gets in his neck, is that it's not a direct link just to the mind flayer, but the feeling that the mind flayer is getting, which is fear. Because as I analyzed what Mr. Clarke says here, it says finish chapter 12, okay, in that Will the Wise episode. Basically, within that episode is right after Will gets infiltrated, okay, and say the next morning when Joyce is about to give him a bath. That scene is where it gets very interesting because right before that happens, okay, is when we start getting a Mr. Clarke lesson, and more specifically about the fear response, okay? And what we see is as this lesson goes on, people, basically what we end up seeing is it cuts to Will walking into his bathroom looking terrified, okay? And looking terrified of something he should not be scared of, right? More specifically, his bathtub and the warm water, all right? That's not something Will should have any fear of, right? So, as we know, like I said, this is after he is infiltrated, but what Will is feeling is a fear response, which in our brains, okay, people, the fear response is what triggers our fight or flight response, which helps us try to survive. So, as I researched more about all of that, there's a lot of connections specifically, say, to the fear of water, to the fear of heat, and to the fear of small spaces. And what you got to keep in mind, people, is that if we connect the sauna test directly, all right, the actual test that is being made, the experiment that is being played out by our group, and more specifically planned by our boy Will, who is experiencing this fear response in this moment. So what we see in the sauna test as well is that when Billy starts to act a certain way, he starts to cry and all of that, basically what we get proof of is that Billy is not there in that moment, that this is something that is just trying to make them believe something, to try and give it what it wants. More specifically, he's trying to mess with Max so that maybe that she just lets him out of there, right? But what happens, people, is Will is not feeling any of this in this moment other than when it gets to a specific point and all of a sudden he goes, oh, Mike, I feel it. He's activated. So in that moment, we talked about this in the sauna test theory, okay? I did a whole theory based off of this scene. But what Will ends up feeling, okay, was what we were trying to figure out is what he's specifically connecting to, okay? And it's not just the mind flayer. Because in that moment, Will does not feel any pain when Billy is feeling pain. So he is not connected to the mind flayer 100%. So all Will is feeling is a specific thing, and what that is, people, is a fear response, the fight or flight response within the mind flayer. And yes, that gets very confusing, but if you watch these scenes a certain way, you start to understand that. Is that when Mr. Clarke is explaining this, when Will's looking at that bathtub, he's scared. So during that scene, Will starts getting flashes of the tunnels, okay? Which is kind of like an idea of tunneling fear, or a fear of tunnels in a sense. So we don't really understand how Will connects to these tunnels just yet, which no doubt in my mind in season 5 we're going to have to get some answers to that. But what we see in season 2, people, is that when they go burn the main source, they burn the hub, is what they call it in that. And that's what really helps get the mind flayer out of Will. There's a lot of other things going on, and they're trying to do this by themselves in Hopper's cabin, and it's not working 100% until they burn that area. So, no doubt in my mind, we're going to have to see that area and get answers to exactly what that hub is, in my opinion, and how Will connects to this hub. But what I'm getting the idea of from this, people, is that Will is feeling a fear response from this hub. So is he connecting to this hive mind that is afraid? And the thing is if this hive mind is affected by this mind flayer, that's what Will would feel, or what maybe this hive mind is trying to tell Will to feel in this moment. Because our bodies, all right, and our minds are triggered to have fear for a specific reason, and pushing away fear is not a good thing. Like how Will does in this show, okay, and how Bob gives him advice is not necessarily the best way in a realistic sense on how to handle fear. By pushing away fear, okay, you are pushing away that in your mind while still keeping that within your mind, okay? You are making your mind weaker by doing that. The reason being for that is because basically our minds, people, are developed to have fear. And the reason it's developed to have fear is in order to help us survive and to fight off things that will say we are afraid of. So what Will does is he chooses to fight something that is triggering that exact area in his brain. It's trying to trigger that area to weaken Will's mind. And yes, I know all of this sounds confusing, and I'm not a fucking teacher, but the point is I've done a little bit of research just off of these specific points. And basically what we see Will do, okay, when he's looking at that bathtub, like I said, is that he's afraid, right? Okay, well, why would Will be afraid of a warm bathtub? He would not, okay? So what's being triggered in his mind is to be afraid, right? And what this mind flayer is doing is it's triggering this so that Will does not go in the water, okay, as we know this. But the reason it's doing it is so that it can survive within Will, and we know this. But by doing so, okay, and by continuously triggering this area of the brain, okay, that triggers your fight or flight response, all right? By doing that, you will overwork that part of the brain, and eventually you will not be able to use that part of your brain. Your brain will not tell you to fight or fight things off that you fear. Basically triggering it to the point where it just allows it to come in on its own and allows to overtake your brain, and it can change your personality. So as we know, one of the most interesting lessons I've ever found that Mr. Clarke gives us is the case of Phineas Gage, which is about a man who got a railroad iron rod through his head and miraculously survived this accident. But the thing is it made changes to his personality, because basically he had a hole in his brain, all right? It basically took a piece of him and it started making him change. So as we know, that's what the mind flayer here is doing, people. Is it's trying to overtake the brain, but we don't understand why it's trying to do this or how it's necessarily doing this 100%. However, what this thing is doing is it's specifically triggering the fear response in order to weaken the body, so it keeps using this response. And by doing so and weakening your fight or flight response, and your response in order to fight things off, this is going to weaken it to the point where it can fully overtake you. And yes, I know this sounds confusing like I keep saying, but if you piece these things together, this shows that Will is only feeling the fear response within the mind flayer. So, as we're going to close this one off, all right, and if you want to know more, all right, we're going to jump into those connections involving everything he says, involving the chapters 10 through 12 and how 12 points to 3 and all that shit. But how I want to close this off and what I want to leave you with questions, all right, is what do you think this could be used for to benefit this show? Because, in my opinion, people, if Will can necessarily feel what the Mind Flayer is afraid of, all right, and he doesn't have this full connection to it anymore, it's not inside of him. Basically, the Mind Flayer being within Henry Creel as Vecna, okay, as we know, if Will can feel what this Mind Flayer is afraid of, he might possibly be able to understand what Henry Creel is also afraid of. And if they know what this thing is afraid of, people, then they will logically know how to beat whatever this is. Basically, by playing a trick on it or playing its own trick on itself, by weakening itself, by making it constantly afraid. And by doing so, if our group knows this, okay, and Will can trigger a point in his brain where he could connect and see when it's afraid, they will understand how to weaken this thing and how to overtake it so that they can overtake it itself. So, I know this was a bunch of just random information, but it led me on the connection, and all this led me on this connection from the very first word this man ever says, the most curious man in this show being Mr. Clarke. So, with all that being said, let me know your thoughts. We're going to jump into a part 2 very, very soon. I got some other theories to come out first. I got kind of a list of what we're going to be doing. But no doubt in my mind, there's connections to this theory as well with that theory because of this. Let's say with that chapter 10, those chapters 10 through 12, okay, that chapter 10 is when Joyce first ever sees that picture of the Will's drawing being the Mind Flayer. Well, one of our next theories that was chosen by the Discord family, okay, if you have not joined, join the DLA Discord. But our next theory is going to be called the Art of Will Byers theory, which we are going to analyze all of his pictures and try and figure out to kind of maybe the premonitions that Will could be having. So, with all that being said, let me know your thoughts about this one. Let me know what you want to cover and let me know what you find involving that little hint involving the very first thing Mr. Clarke says. So, as always, I love each and every single one of you. Keep subscribing, liking, following this journey, and you guys already know we out.